Nicodemus is an interesting character. You see, he's a Pharisee. He's a Jewish rabbi, a very learned Jewish rabbi, who belonged to a sect of Jews who were passionate about following the law to the nth degree. He was also on the ruling council, the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. He isn't a nobody, and he isn't unaware of what's going on in the world. At this time, still early in Jesus' ministry, Jesus has already encountered the Pharisees, and he certainly hasn't made any friends by overturning the tables in the temple courts just prior to this story. Jesus has been healing and giving signs of God's presence and God's care for the people in the land. Nicodemus knows of Jesus, that's for certain, and he arranges to meet him at night. Well, why at night? Well, Jesus is a controversial figure, but the Pharisees have met him during the day and in public to discuss and accuse him of things. Nicodemus wants more, and depending on who you ask, he might be hoping that Jesus is the Messiah. He might be just wanting to get some things straight without others talking over him or interrupting, or he might just be ashamed to profess his faith openly. I tend to go with the latter, that he's dipping his toes in the water, but not so far that others might see what he's doing. We don't get the beginning of this conversation between Jesus and Nicodemus, but we're told that Jesus says, "I assure you that unless someone is born anew, it's not possible to see God's kingdom." Well, Nicodemus doesn't know what to do with this. Born again? Born anew? Some translations will say born from above. All three of these are valid translations of the same word. How can this be? He says. Born again? Born from above? I'm old. It's impossible to enter the mother's womb for a second time and be born, isn't it? You see, it's clear at this point that before one goes any further that Jesus and Nicodemus are talking past each other. You see, they might be talking in the same language and they might be in the same conversation, but they aren't speaking the same language, and at this point they're not in the same conversation. Jesus insists that unless someone is born of water and the Spirit, it's not possible to enter God's kingdom. Whatever is born of flesh is flesh, and whatever is born of spirit is spirit. Don't be surprised that I said to you, you must be born anew. God's Spirit blows wherever it wishes. You hear its sound, but you don't know where it comes from or where it is going. It's the same with everyone who is born of the Spirit. Jesus isn't talking about physically being born again through a mother's womb. He mentions flesh and water, flesh and the Spirit, and he contrasts those. So this being born again is something altogether than a physical birth. Jesus isn't making some claim that flesh is bad by using those contrasts, but he's trying to say that something else is being talked about here. That only those who have been born of this Spirit are able to join in with what God is doing. This last verse that I just read described the Spirit as wind. The Greek word here can be translated as wind or spirit or breath. So Jesus is both playing with words and giving something else to Nicodemus to think about, to help him grasp what he's talking about. So I'll read that verse again. God's Spirit blows wherever it wishes. You hear its sound, but you don't know where it comes from or where it is going. It's the same with everyone who is born of the Spirit. Now, how about the other way that word might work? The wind blows wherever it wishes. You hear its sound, but you don't know where it comes from or where it is going. It's the same with everyone who is born of the wind. You see, those who are born of the Spirit are born in a way that is beyond understanding. Just as the wind is not something that, at least in those days, can be easily comprehended. Even today, it's something that you might know the science behind, but it still confounds you. It's not something you can easily determine how it happens. But just like these people, there's evidence that something has happened. Like the wind, you can feel it. There is effect. There's evidence that they've been changed, but how that change occurs, how it happens, like the wind, it's kind of puzzling. This isn't something that Nicodemus grasped easily. For his second response is, how are these things possible? Jesus sort of sternly talks to him for this answer, and he says, you are a teacher of Israel and you don't know these things? I assure that we speak about what we know and testify about what we have seen, but you don't receive our testimony. If I've told you about the earthly things and you don't believe, how will you believe if I tell you about the heavenly things? Again, Jesus recognizes that they're talking past each other. Nicodemus is not on board with what he's saying. And perhaps he's a bit exasperated at this point. Nicodemus should know this stuff. He's a Pharisee. He's a member of the ruling council. He's called a teacher, a master of Israel. He should know what's going on. He should be aware of sort of what's going on. How can Jesus possibly explain to Nicodemus complicated stuff, heavenly things, if the basics, the earthly things, aren't being understood? And so Jesus tries one more time to explain what's happening. He tries a different tactic, and we're brought to some of the more famous and perhaps forgotten parts of the New Testament. So don't stop reading, don't stop listening when I get past that first verse that you know. God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, so that everyone who believes in him won't perish, but will have eternal life. God didn't send his Son into the world to judge the world, but that the world might be saved through him. Whoever believes in him isn't judged. Whoever doesn't believe in him is already judged, because they don't believe in the name of God's only Son. Jesus lays it out plainly for Nicodemus here. God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that the world might know God through the Son, and so that the world might have fulfilling life in relationship to God. If you've ever read that verse and thought it was all about getting to heaven, it's not. It's just not. But what about the next verse? God didn't send his Son into the world to judge the world, but that the world might be saved through him. Whoever believes in him isn't judged. Whoever doesn't believe in him is already judged, because they don't believe in the name of God's only Son. Well, why does Jesus add this part? Did Nicodemus believe that God was sending someone into the world to judge, or, as some translations have, condemn the world? Well, yeah, that was a belief that existed. Yes, Jesus is telling Nicodemus that the way he thought that God operated, that one day God would show up for a reckoning, isn't actually how things are. God wasn't showing up or sending someone in God's place to find out who was naughty or nice. Rather, God was sending someone to save the world, to show them another way, and to change the way they thought about things. And so Jesus ends the conversation with, "This is the basis for judgment. The light came into the world, and people loved darkness more than the light, for their actions are evil. All who would do wicked things hate the light, and don't come to the light for fear that their actions will be exposed to the light. Whoever does the truth comes to the light so that it can be seen that their actions were done in God." There's another passage where Jesus is using some images and playing with some words here. But essentially what Jesus is saying is that God's character demonstrated in the world through Jesus shows the evil in the world for what it is, by comparison. I've worked with a few people that this passage reminded me of. No, I'm not saying that they were evil, not at all. I want to get that clear right now. Most of them were pretty hard workers. They got work done. They did what they were asked to do. They did it on time. However, if you ended up looking at what they did, if you checked their work, their records, their drawing, their time cards, or their browser history, suddenly they were different people altogether. What looked like great work wasn't. What looked like a spotless personal record wasn't. When held up to scrutiny, they were terrible employees. Not just a few mistakes here and there, but sometimes work that wasn't even started was just made to look like it was started. You see, when God enters the world in Jesus, everything is made plain for what it is by comparison. The judgment is this, that if it doesn't match up with what Jesus is doing, then it's not of God. Unfortunately, Nicodemus still is on the receiving end of perhaps some of Jesus' exasperation. And so Jesus says, whoever does the truth comes to the light so that it can be seen that their actions were done in God. This play on light and darkness might be a little bit of what Jesus, or what we would call Jesus throwing shade. Nicodemus comes to Jesus, the light, but he does it in darkness. It's a little bit of play on words. It may not be what Jesus meant, but perhaps there's something we can glean from that. Well, so what? What does this passage help us? What meaning can be drawn from this passage? In John 3:16, what good is it outside of a really feel-good verse that we can quote to other people or slap on a bumper sticker or use in our professional wrestler's name? It's a throwback to Austin 3:16 there for some of you. Well, the thing is, all of us need to be born from above. We all need to have a change in the way we operate, view the world, and live in the world. And it isn't a one-time affair, this born from above. I gave my life to Christ at age 16 and I was baptized. I was born from above. Years later, I finally grasped what that meant on my life. And even later, I grasped how that changed what was important in my life. And then it happened yet again when I found out church wasn't about me. It happened yet again when I realized my politics and some of the things that were going on in my life didn't match with what Jesus said. And I had to reject a whole bunch of things that really, they only made sense in my old way of thinking before I was born from above. Maybe the first or second time. All of us need to be born from above. And it doesn't matter who you are or where you came from. You see, as I said, Nicodemus was a learned rabbi, a Pharisee, a member of the ruling council. He was, maybe you want to say that he was the kid in Sunday school from age 2. And he went to every event the congregation had. He did Bible quizzing, he's read his Bible every night, he did devotions, he went to every youth retreat, and yet, he was the one that said, that's not possible. That can't be the way it is. No one is exempt from being born from above. You see, all of us will face confusion, doubt, and sometimes outright denial of what Jesus wants us to know. Nicodemus didn't accept what Jesus told him. He didn't get it. That's impossible. That doesn't make sense. And so Jesus might say, accept a slap on your face when someone has hit you on the other side. But it hurts. God doesn't want me to hurt. That doesn't make sense. Love your enemies? But that doesn't make sense. I can still hate them. I should kill my enemies, or why should I love my enemies? That doesn't make sense. You see, every time one of us faces these moments of that can't possibly be true, just as Nicodemus had, we need to be born from above. We need to see God in the person of Jesus so that our understanding, our deeds, might be shown for what they really are. Darkness in the presence of the light. One thing before we close. English grammar and Greek grammar are different in a few ways. Greek grammar is very precise, and it can be precise, much more precise than English, without being awkward. So, I'm going to read this verse that you've all heard before, but I'll read it. And when I read it, I want you to hear it this way from now on. God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, so that everyone who is believing in him won't perish, but will have eternal life. You see, I changed from everyone who believes to everyone who is believing. That might seem awkward, but let me explain. This isn't a one-time thing. The Greek doesn't allow it to be a one-time thing. This isn't an accepting of a fact or some sort of trivia. I'll give you an example. I believe in the gravitational theory. I live my life as if things are going to fall to the ground if I let them go. That's not just something I know, like some fact that's stored in my mind, but it's something that I live according to every day. My actions change because I know that. I also believe in the germ theory, that microbes correspond to disease and sickness. And so I wash my hands and I don't eat food that is spoiled, because I believe daily that that's going to change the way I live. I come to know the kingdom and be part of it because I seek to be born from above. I don't expect that my current understanding of God is as good as it gets or as correct as it gets. A little bit more about Nicodemus. After this encounter, we don't hear from him a little while, but I wanted to know what happened to him, and some of you may want to know. We do find later in the New Testament that he is defending Jesus at Jesus' trial among the other Pharisees. He's overruled, but he does defend Jesus a little bit. And we know that after the crucifixion, he purchases a very large, very expensive amount of perfume to honor Jesus. The Eastern Orthodox and the Catholic churches celebrate him as a saint. There is a feast day for Nicodemus. Whether he got it or not, whether he was born from above, is unknown, though. So, as we approach the table of the Lord this morning, or this afternoon rather, perhaps you're thinking of the impossibilities of the Christian faith. There's a God who wants to save the world by entering into it, not just affecting it from a distance. A God who wants to save the world by dying at the hands of God's creation. A God who is to be worshipped because God was defeated by God's creation. Those are crazy things that don't make sense. It is impossible, isn't it, that bread and wine, or bread and grape juice, communicate the mystery of Christ through all believers? That's impossible, isn't it? When these things come, seek to be born from above and willingly change the way you think by accepting the reality of God through Jesus, his life, his death, and his resurrection. If this is your first time coming to the table or professing faith in Christ, know that it's not simply saying a prayer or getting a set of rules to follow or even ticking a box. As Jesus says, being born of the Spirit is inexplicable as the wind. And I can't tell you how it's going to happen. I can't tell you how being born from above will happen for you or when it will happen for you. But perhaps in coming to this table today, accepting something that is impossible, maybe that thing can happen, that corporate eating and drinking of this bread and wine, maybe that's your first step to being born from above.